Bullets ripped through the night sky as alarms screamed and searchlights carved the jungle wide open. In the chaos, one woman, once forgotten, now a ghost from the SEALs, clutched a wounded medic while terrified civilians stumbled at her side. With a single thermite charge she had hidden for 12 years, Raven Lockhart blew a hole through the compound wall and drove them into the ocean's black embrace. To the outside world, Raven was just a quiet coastal doctor, a woman devoted to her son and a life far removed from war. Yet beneath that calm surface lay scars and a lockbox of secrets. She had once been one of the Navy's most decorated medics. The question is, why, after 12 years of silence, did the Navy call her back? In a windswept coastal town, Raven Lockhart appeared to be nothing more than a quiet doctor living an ordinary life. Her life seemed simple, almost unremarkable, tucked away in a windswept town on the North Carolina shoreline. Every morning she unlocked the modest two-room clinic that bore her name, treating fishermen with sunburnt shoulders, children with skinned knees, and tourists who had tangled themselves with jellyfish. Locals called her Doc Lockhart. They admired her calm efficiency, her polite smile, her steady hands. No one ever questioned where she had come from or why her eyes carried the weight of storms. Small towns thrived on routine, and Raven had perfected the art of blending into it. But behind that calm exterior lived another life, one she had buried 12 years ago. At home, Raven shared a weather-beaten cottage with her 16-year-old son, Daniel. He was tall for his age, sharp-eyed, carrying the restless energy of someone just beginning to test the boundaries of independence. Daniel adored the ocean. After school, he would take his surfboard and vanish into the waves, salt clinging to his hair as he returned home hungry and sunburnt. Raven loved watching him from the porch, the boy she had raised alone, the anchor that kept her tied to this new life she had built. And yet, even with Daniel's laughter filling the house, the nights were never easy. At 03 WAG, Raven often woke in a cold sweat, her breath ragged, her heart pounding as if she were still crouched in a jungle kill zone. The echoes of gunfire, the screams of wounded men, the smell of cordite and blood. They all clawed their way back into her dreams. She would sit at the edge of her bed, staring into the dark, whispering to herself that it was over, that she was safe, that Daniel was safe. But the scars across her shoulder blade told a different story, one that no amount of whispered reassurance could erase. She told her son it came from falling off a bike when she was 12. Daniel never pressed her, but he noticed. He always noticed. Hidden in the back of Raven's closet, under winter coats she rarely wore, sat a lockbox. The metal was tarnished, its edges dented, its weight far heavier than its size should allow. For 10 years, the combination hadn't changed. Daniel's birthday, the only number that tethered her past to her present. Inside lay the remnants of the life she had sworn to abandon. A Navy trident pin, dulled by time, 2 dog tags that once hung against her chest on missions she never spoke of, a laminated card with clearance codes that no civilian should possess, and a folded slip of waterproof paper with a single phone number. Sometimes on the sleepless nights, Raven would unlock the box and run her fingers across those artifacts. Each piece carried a memory sharp enough to cut. The trident reminded her of the day she earned it, the grueling months of training, the bone-deep exhaustion, and the pride that burned brighter than the bruises on her skin. The dog tags whispered the names of friends who hadn't come back. The clearance codes were a relic of access she should never need again, doors into shadows better left closed. And that phone number, that was the one thing she feared most. She told herself she kept the lockbox only for emergencies, but deep down, Raven knew the truth. She kept it because part of her, the part that had rappelled out of helicopters into places that didn't exist on maps, the part that had patched wounds while bullets tore through the night, wasn't convinced her war was truly over. Her neighbors never guessed. To them, Raven was kind, reliable, professional. They had no idea she locked every window at dusk, or that she scanned every doorway before entering a building. They didn't notice how her posture shifted when a stranger walked into her clinic, how her hand twitched as though reaching for a weapon she no longer carried. The habits of a Navy SEAL never faded. They only went dormant. And so Raven lived in 2 worlds at once. By day she was the healer, the mother, the quiet woman by the sea. By night she wrestled with ghosts, with scars both visible and hidden. The lockbox waited in the closet, silent and patient, as if it knew what Raven refused to admit. Because deep down, she understood something she could never say aloud. You can walk away from the battlefield, but the battlefield never really lets you go. The day had been ordinary, almost painfully so. Raven Lockhart closed up her clinic as the sun slid toward the horizon, painting the ocean in streaks of gold and crimson. The salty wind carried the distant cries of gulls, and the streets were nearly empty. She locked the front door, slid the key into her pocket, and for a moment let herself breathe in the comfort of routine. This was the life she had built. Simple, quiet, controlled. But then the sound of heavy tires on gravel shattered that illusion. A black SUV rolled into the lot, its tinted windows reflecting the dying light. There were no insignias, no plates that could be traced, no hesitation in the way it pulled to a stop. Raven froze, every nerve in her body screaming with recognition. Vehicles like that did not belong here, not unless they carried ghosts. Two men stepped out, plain clothes but posture rigid, movements deliberate, the kind of men trained to move in shadows. One approached her slowly, his hands visible, careful not to provoke a reaction. He spoke her name with a voice that was too formal, too practiced. Raven Lockhart. The sound of her full name, spoken with authority, cut through her like a blade. She hadn't heard it in years. Around here, she was only Doc Lockhart. To Daniel, she was Mom. To the Navy, she had been Lieutenant Lockhart, once. Hearing it now was a reminder that the past had not died, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. She didn't respond right away. The parking lot was empty, Daniel still at soccer practice. For a second, she considered pretending not to know the name. Pretending she was just the doctor everyone thought she was. But the man was already reaching into his jacket, slow and deliberate, pulling out a sealed envelope. It was thick, heavy paper, unmarked except for a single line. LTCDR Raven Lockhart. Eyes only. Her stomach clenched. I'm not cleared for anything anymore, she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her. You were, the man replied quietly. And right now, you might be the only one who remembers how this works. He didn't wait for an answer. He extended the envelope, held it steady until she took it, and then with a single nod, he returned to the SUV. The vehicle pulled away without squealing tires or flashing lights. Smooth, professional, like a ghost that had never been there at all. Raven stood alone, the envelope heavy in her hands. She wanted to throw it into the sea, to pretend it had never found her. But her fingers betrayed her, tearing the seal open the moment she stepped into her kitchen. Inside were 3 items. A folded sheet of paper with a cryptic message. A grainy black and white aerial photograph. A set of GPS coordinates scrawled in red ink. The paper read, Sulu Archipelago. Aid convoy intercepted. Extraction compromised. Subject, Victor Kilo 3. Consult only, not a reinstatement order. Her eyes drifted to the photograph. A jungle compound tucked into familiar hills. Figures blurred by distance, surrounded by armed guards, and one detail that froze her blood. A field medic's pack. Not just any pack. Her design, one of only a dozen ever issued, meant for deep insertion medics. The sight made her hands shake. 12 years had passed since she had last seen that compound. She had walked out of it alive when others had not. She had buried half of it with explosives, swearing she would never return. And now someone was trapped there again, carrying gear that tied directly to her past. In the margin of the paper, 3 words were written in small, deliberate handwriting. Recall potential active. Raven gripped the edge of her kitchen sink until her knuckles turned white. She thought of Daniel, 16 years old, waiting for her to pick him up, blissfully unaware of the storm pressing in on their quiet lives. Could she look him in the eye and pretend nothing had happened? Could she risk leaving him without answers if she went back into the shadows? Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened kitchen window. She didn't see the coastal doctor the town knew. She saw the Navy SEAL medic who had patched wounds under fire, who had dragged men twice her size through mud and blood, who had sworn to never let her team die without a fight, and now the past demanded her again. Raven sat at the table, the photographs spread out in front of her, the coordinates burned into her mind. She thought of the people trapped in that jungle stronghold, civilians and soldiers alike, waiting for a rescue that might never come. Someone else's children, someone else's family. She had built a life around protecting Daniel, but wasn't that the same vow she once made to her teammates? To protect lives when no one else could? This was the cruel truth of veterans who tried to disappear. You could change your name, your address, even your heartbeat, but the world never let you truly escape. The skills, the instincts, the debts, they waited, silent and patient, until the knock came again. Raven closed the lockbox later that night, the trident pin and dog tags catching the dim light before the lid snapped shut. Her decision wasn't final yet. She told herself she needed more time, but deep down she knew the truth. She had always known that one day the past would find her, and tonight it had. The drive south felt like a return to a world Raven had sworn to abandon. The coastal roads gave way to military checkpoints, and finally to the gates of a place that technically didn't exist. Fort Halcyon, an abandoned naval installation on paper, but in reality a shadow base where operations too sensitive for headlines were born. The guard at the entrance barely glanced at her ID before waving her through. That was when she knew. Her clearance had never been erased, only buried. It was as if the system had always expected her return. As Raven stepped out of her truck, the familiar smell of jet fuel mixed with salt air wrapped around her like an old unwanted coat. Floodlights cut across the compound, illuminating silhouettes of helicopters and armored vehicles. Young operators moved in disciplined formations, their rifles slung casually but their eyes sharp. She remembered when she had once walked like that, young, invincible, convinced the world could be bent to her will. Inside the operations building, time seemed to collapse. The same steel-gray walls, the same hum of servers and radios, the same stale air that smelled faintly of coffee and tension. And then she saw him, Commander Adrian Locke. 12 years older, his hair threaded with gray, but the same squared shoulders and deliberate posture. Once Raven had dragged him out of a collapsed building in Afghanistan with a shattered leg. He had sworn he owed her his life. Now he stood in front of her, not as a survivor, but as the one pulling her back into the shadows. "Raven," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Commander," she replied, offering no warmth. "You opened the packet, so you know why you're here." Raven's eyes flicked to the wall covered in satellite imagery. The Sulu archipelago stared back at her in shades of black and gray. Dense jungle, jagged coastlines, and in the center, a fortified compound she had hoped never to see again. "You didn't drag me here to reminisce," she said flatly. Adrian nodded, gesturing to the images. "To 3 days ago, an aid convoy was ambushed. Our quick reaction force attempted a rescue. We lost contact 12 hours in. Civilians and operators are being held inside. You know that terrain better than anyone alive." The room shifted as young SEALs filed in. They looked like recruiting posters, muscular, sharp-eyed, every inch the embodiment of modern special operations. But beneath their composure was something Raven recognized immediately: skepticism. One of them, a lieutenant barely older than Daniel, leaned back in his chair and muttered just loud enough for others to hear. "She's the consultant?" Raven ignored him, studying the terrain maps. With a single finger, she traced a ridgeline no one had marked. "You're looking at the north approach. That's a kill zone. They'll expect you there. If you want your people back alive, you go through here." She tapped a narrow creek bed hidden under dense foliage. "It floods in monsoon season, but right now it's your best chance." The lieutenant scoffed. "With respect, ma'am, intel shows that creek dried up years ago." Raven turned to him, her gaze steady. "Typhoon 2 years ago. The creek carved a new channel. Your intel is outdated. If you follow it, you'll walk your team straight into an ambush." The room fell silent. Even Adrian studied her with the quiet acknowledgement of someone reminded why she had survived missions that killed others. This was the moment she felt the weight of her presence. She was not here to impress them with rank or muscles. She was here because experience, the kind written in scars and sleepless nights, carried truths no satellite could see. Adrian broke the silence. That's why she's here. She walked out of that compound alive when others didn't. You may not like it, but you'd better listen. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Raven leaned back, folding her arms. You don't need to like me. You just need to decide if you want to come home. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, the room shifted. The young operators leaned forward, not because they trusted her yet, but because they couldn't afford not to. Raven studied their faces, remembering when she had been dismissed in the same way, when whispers had followed her through training halls, doubting a woman's place in combat. Back then, she had learned the only answer was to outlast, outthink, and outfight every expectation. And now, standing in front of a new generation, she felt the same skepticism directed at her. Only this time, she didn't need to prove herself for her own sake. She needed to prove herself for the lives hanging in the balance. The military still carried old biases. Women like Raven were judged twice, on skill and on belonging. To the young, she seemed past her prime. But combat isn't about image. Strength fades, yet experience only sharpens. Raven proved survival comes not from arrogance, but from adapting and carrying failure without breaking. The sea was black glass beneath a moonless sky as the RHIB skimmed across the waves, engines humming low to avoid detection. Raven Lockhart crouched near the bow, her eyes scanning the jagged outline of the Sulu archipelago rising from the darkness. The salt spray hit her face, but she didn't flinch. Every detail of this approach was burned into her memory. She had come this way before, 12 years ago, and every nerve in her body still remembered. Behind her, the young SEAL team adjusted their gear, quiet but restless. Their leader, Lieutenant Collins, whispered the countdown to insertion. Raven didn't need it. She already knew they would hit the beach at 03:15, just as the tide receded, revealing the narrow sandbar she had once used to slip inside. Some instincts never died. When the RHIB finally cut its engines and drifted to shore, Raven was the first into the surf. Her boots sank into the wet sand as she raised a fist, signaling halt. The operators glanced at one another, unsure who had put her in charge, but they followed anyway. Raven knelt, running her hand across the ground. Broken branches, fresh prints. 6, maybe 8, she whispered. Passed through less than 10 hours ago. Not locals, trained. Collins moved up beside her. Thermal shows nothing. Cloud cover's too dense, Raven replied. You're running blind. Stay low. For the next 2 kilometers, she guided them through the jungle with precision that unsettled the team. She didn't hesitate at forks in the path. Didn't second guess when she adjusted their route to avoid a clearing. Every move was calculated, born from nights spent mapping this terrain in blood and fear. By dawn, the compound loomed before them. Camp 3 Echo. Concrete walls crowned with razor wire. Guard towers at each corner. Floodlights sweeping the perimeter. New construction lined the courtyard, but beneath the upgrades, Raven still recognized the bones of the place. Her nightmares hadn't lied. She raised binoculars, scanning the compound. Southwest building, 2nd floor. That's where they'll keep them. Collins frowned. How do you know? Because that's where they kept us, Raven said flatly. The air went still. No one asked further. The plan was simple. Raven would infiltrate through the storm drain she had once used to escape. Confirm the hostages, mark egress routes, then signal the team. But simplicity in theory was chaos in execution. She stripped down to the bare essentials, a small med kit, a radio, and her blade. Then, without ceremony, she slid into the drain. The concrete was cracked, overgrown, but still intact. She crawled 30 feet on elbows and knees, heart pounding with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. By the time she reached the grate, voices filtered down. Men speaking in low tones, boots scraping against pavement. Raven peered through. The courtyard looked almost identical to 12 years ago, except for one detail. The guards were disciplined. Not local militias, not ragtag insurgents. These were trained soldiers, equipped and alert. This wasn't just a terrorist camp. It was a military operation. She slipped out silently, moving toward the southwest building. Her body obeyed muscle memory she had thought long gone. Step placement, breath control, the patience of a predator. Within minutes, she reached the staircase and climbed. On the second floor, she found them. 5 civilians huddled in the corner, their faces gaunt but alive. 2 U.S. advisors, one unconscious, his leg bandaged with cloth already soaked through. And then, in the corner, clutching a medic pack too familiar to ignore, was a young sailor. He looked up, eyes wide, and whispered hoarsely, "You're Raven Lockhart." She froze. "And you are?" "Petty Officer Ryan Cole," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. I studied your reports, your old mission notes. That's why I brought the team through Route Bravo." Raven's stomach turned. Route Bravo had collapsed years ago, destroyed by a typhoon. Outdated intel had trapped them here. "You trusted notes written for a different war," she said quietly, kneeling beside him to check his wound. "That's how you ended up bleeding in a place no one should have returned to." Ryan winced as she tightened the bandage. "I thought, if it worked for you, it would work for us." Her jaw clenched, torn between frustration and pity. He wasn't wrong to admire her legacy, but he had mistaken history for gospel, and history had nearly gotten him killed. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch, this is Lockhart. Hostages located, 6 total, including 1 critical. Prep for extraction. Situation is volatile." Colin's voice crackled back. "Copy. Stand by." As she organized the civilians, Ryan caught her wrist. "You came back. After all these years? Why?" Raven looked at him, at the sweat on his brow, at the fear hiding behind his resolve. She thought of Daniel, safe at home, never knowing how close his mother still lived to war. "Because sometimes," she said softly, "you don't get to choose. The past chooses for you." The building shook as alarms blared. Somewhere outside, a guard had noticed movement. The compound roared to life. Raven snapped into motion. "Move! We're blown!" As they rushed down the stairwell, bullets cracked in the courtyard. Ryan, pale but defiant, raised his sidearm and fired in steady bursts, covering the civilians as Raven dragged the unconscious advisor. For all his mistakes, his courage was undeniable. It was more than a firefight. It was a clash of generations. Raven, scarred by choices she could never erase. Ryan, young and eager, mistaking legend for guidance. His error nearly doomed them, yet his courage reminded her of herself long ago. War's truth is simple. The young carry boldness, the old carry scars, and only together can they endure. The alarms shattered the dawn. A piercing wail tore through the compound, echoed by the thunder of boots and the metallic rattle of weapons. Searchlights snapped to life, cutting through the haze. For Raven, the nightmare had returned in full force. "Move!" she shouted, dragging the unconscious advisor toward the courtyard. The hostages stumbled behind her, Ryan limping but steady, pistol raised to cover their retreat. Bullets chewed into concrete as guards poured out of the barracks. The SEAL team outside had no time to breach. The enemy already knew. They sprinted toward the storm drain, Raven's chosen escape. But just meters away, heavy gunfire erupted from the towers. The path was a killing field, the drain unreachable. Civilians dropped to the ground, crying out in fear. Raven's mind raced. There was only one option left, the one she had sworn she would never use. She yanked open her med kit and pulled out a small black device. To the hostages, it looked insignificant, no bigger than a phone. To Raven, it was 12 years of waiting. Ryan's eyes widened. "Is that?" "Thermite," she cut him off. "Our only way out." She slammed the charge against the east wall. Sparks erupted, molten fire eating through the reinforced concrete. Heat roared, painting the courtyard an orange glow. In seconds, the wall cracked, then buckled, collapsing in a burst of smoke and flame. The blast took down part of a watchtower, sending debris crashing into the guards below. "Through the breach!" Raven yelled. One by one, the civilians crawled through the jagged opening. Raven shoved the advisor ahead, then turned to Ryan. He was pale, drenched in sweat, but still defiant. "Go!" she barked. He staggered through, firing a last burst behind him. Raven followed last, covering their retreat. On the other side, the ground sloped sharply toward the coastline. Beyond lay the ocean, dark, endless, and their only hope. But the compound was fully awake now. Engines roared, radios crackled, and the thrum of helicopters began to rise. They scrambled down the slope, loose soil crumbling beneath their boots. Behind them, tracer rounds lit the air, slicing through branches. Ahead, the sea waited, black and merciless under the pale light of dawn. At the water's edge, Raven didn't hesitate. "Everyone in! Stay together! Help each other!" The hostages plunged into the surf, waves crashing against them. Ryan struggled but forced himself forward, teeth gritted in pain. Raven dragged the advisor beside him, keeping his head above water. The current was strong, pulling them seaward. Raven looked back. Searchlights swept the shoreline. Gunfire stitched the waves. Then came the sound she dreaded, the chop of rotor blades. Enemy helicopters lifted above the tree line, spotlights scanning the ocean. "Swim!" Raven urged. "Don't stop!" The next 10 minutes blurred into pure survival. The sea frothed with bullets, white trails cutting dangerously close. The civilians gasped and flailed, but desperation pushed them forward. Raven's muscles burned as she fought the current, her mind calculating distance, speed, and the likelihood of rescue. Then, faint at first but growing louder, came another sound, the deep roar of American engines. Out on the horizon, a RHIB raced toward them, its bow cutting through waves. The SEAL team had launched early. Salvation was near, if they could survive long enough. The first helicopter swung overhead, unleashing a burst from its mounted gun. Water exploded around them, geysers of spray rising like walls. Raven shoved Ryan under the surface, pulling him with her as bullets shredded the sea above. When they resurfaced, the RHIB was closer, crew members shouting, arms outstretched. "Go! Go! Go!" Colin's voice boomed as he leaned over the side. One by one, the civilians were hauled aboard, coughing and trembling. Raven pushed Ryan up, then the advisor. She was last, clinging to the edge, as another burst of gunfire raked the water. Strong hands yanked her onto the deck, just as the RHIB's engine screamed to full power. The boat tore across the waves, enemy helicopters circling overhead, tracers chasing them like vengeful ghosts. But the SEALs returned fire with mounted weapons, forcing the aircraft to pull back. Slowly the distance widened. The compound faded into the tree line, its alarms still wailing uselessly. Raven collapsed onto the deck, chest heaving, salt water mixing with sweat and blood. Around her, civilians clung to one another, Ryan grimacing but alive, the advisor unconscious but stable. For a moment, the only sound was the roar of the engine and the rush of the sea. They had escaped, but the cost still clung to Raven, the images of fire, screams, the acrid stench of burning thermite. Survival was never clean. It was never heroic in the way movies promised. War's truth was never glory. It was chaos. Not choreographed heroics, but mud, bullets, smoke, and fear. Survival was ugly and raw, defined not by triumph, but by the scars of those who return. For Raven, tonight proved it again. No matter how far you run, war always remembers your name. The return to Fort Halcyon was quiet, almost surreal after the chaos of fire and seawater. The hostages were escorted away by medics, shaken but alive. Ryan Cole was carried on a stretcher, pale but breathing, his wounds stabilized. For him, there would be months of recovery, yet he would live. The civilians, too, finally free, wept into the arms of waiting staff. The mission, at least on paper, was a success. Raven sat in the debriefing room, the same steel walls closing in as they had all those years ago. Her clothes were still damp, her skin raw from salt, but her eyes were clear. She had done what she came to do. Across from her, Commander Adrian Locke leaned forward. His voice was calm but carried a weight only old soldiers shared. "Ryan will make it. 6 months, maybe less, and he'll be back on his feet. The civilians are already on flights home." Raven nodded, though the words didn't bring relief. Survival wasn't victory. It was simply breathing another day. Adrian studied her for a long moment. "Command is impressed. They want to offer you reinstatement. Full rank, full authority. You could choose your assignment, your people. You wouldn't just consult. You'd lead again." The offer hung in the air, heavy as the ocean that had nearly claimed them. Raven let the silence stretch. She thought of Daniel, 16 on the edge of manhood, waiting at home for a mother who had promised to be present. She thought of the years she had spent building a life away from shadows, a fragile sanctuary of school runs, dinners, and sunsets on the porch. "I can't," she said finally. Adrian didn't flinch. "Because of Daniel. Because of everything," she replied. "I've given enough to war. I can't ask my son to give too." For a moment, the commander looked older than she remembered. He nodded slowly, like a man who had asked the same question of himself once and found no easy answer. "You know it doesn't disappear," he said softly. "What you carry, who you are." Raven gave a small, tired smile. "I know. I just have to learn how to live with both." They stood, shook hands, and for the first time in days, Raven felt a weight lift, not because the war was gone, but because she had chosen which part of it she would let follow her home. 2 weeks later, the clinic reopened. The sign above the door still read, "Doc Lockhart." Patients trickled in with fishing cuts, flu symptoms, and sunburns. Life moved on, indifferent to what had been fought and lost in the jungle. At dinner, Daniel finally asked the question he had carried for years. "Mom, were you in the military?" Raven looked at him, no longer a boy, but not yet a man. He deserved the truth. "Yes, a long time ago." "Did you do important things?" She thought of Ryan Cole, of the civilians who walked free because she went back, of the faces she hadn't been able to save. Her voice was steady. "I tried to help people who needed it. That's all." Daniel studied her, then nodded. It was enough. That night after he slept, Raven sat on the porch listening to the waves. The lockbox remained hidden in the closet, its contents untouched but not forgotten. She knew she could never truly close that part of herself away. The warrior and the mother, both were her, inseparable, eternal. For those who serve, the struggle is timeless. Duty or family, war or peace. Raven chose Daniel, yet new warriors never fully return. Their scars shape the lives they rebuild. Her battle now was to live as both healer and soldier, mother and fighter. And if the call came again, the question would remain. Some battles never end. In the end, Raven Lockhart's journey is more than a story of a Navy SEAL pulled back into the shadows. It's a reflection of choices we all face. In today's world, you don't need to wear a uniform to feel the tension between duty and family, between the person you used to be and the one you're trying to become. Many veterans, first responders, and even ordinary parents know this truth. Scars don't always show on the surface, but they shape the way we protect and care for others. Maybe Raven's greatest lesson is that survival is not about leaving the past behind. It's about carrying it with wisdom without letting it define your future. And perhaps that's something all of us, young or old, can relate to. So here's the question for you. If the past you tried to bury came knocking, would you answer? Or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one, and your perspective helps shape these stories. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that some battles never truly end.